Okay, let me just give you an introduction before we get into it, if that's cool. Okay, so Professor Schiffer, he got his PhD from Oxford. He has 3 books, Meaning, Remnants of Meaning, and The Things We Mean. I have 2 of them here. If you can pick them up, make sure you do, because these books are absolutely excellent. He's been a professor of California, Arizona, Berkeley, and is now a civil professor of New York University. And is probably one of the foremost experts on meaning. Now, what I wanted to start with you, Professor, if that's okay, is in Remnants, that was considered sort of an attack on analytical philosophy, wasn't it?
Not quite on analytical philosophy, on a certain way of doing the theory of meaning. That a way I had defended and tried to advance in my first book, Meaning, was essentially a kind of Gracian program. When I was a graduate student at Oxford, I did some work and then read Grice and realized that we were thinking along the same lines. We're seeing speech acts as just one more kind of rational, goal-directed, intentional behavior, and thinking that the meanings of the sounds we utter have to be explicated in terms of those speech acts. And that was the essence of his account. I thought his account of speaker meaning was illuminating as an account of telling, but not as an account of speaker meaning. So when I began working on my dissertation with Peter Strawson, the first thing I did was to say what was wrong with Grice's account. One of the things I pointed out is that if Grice's account was correct, then although he wrote and published an article called Meaning in the Philosophical Review, he would not have meant anything in producing his sentences. And the reason for that is because it was a necessary condition on his account of speaker meaning that in order to mean something, I have what the speaker has to intend to produce in the hearer, a belief by means of the hearer's recognition of the speaker's intention. But that's not how we intend to produce beliefs in things like math or philosophy and so on. If I give a philosophical argument, I don't intend you to believe it because I'm saying it or my authority. If you ask me what my middle name is, and I tell you it's Richard, then I expect you to believe me because you take my saying as good evidence. But if I give you some, cockamamie philosophical argument to prove this, that, or the other thing, you're not going to accept it because of my authority. You're gonna think it through and so on. And also it wasn't sufficient. And the insufficiency of the Grice account led to my thinking of a very important notion, which unfortunately David Lewis also thought of. And this was a notion of mutual knowledge. That mutual knowledge turned out to be an important concept in the reconstruction of speaker meaning. And the notion goes like this, that two people, A and B, mutually know P. If they each know P, okay, they each know that they each know P, they each know that they each know that they each know P, and so on ad infinitum. And this notion caught on and became quite well known in economics, political theory. I mean, there were foreshadowings of it in work in political theory, like in game theory. So that was good. And David Lewis had a similar, not quite the same notion at about the same time. So that's how I got into it. Grice never offered an account of expression meaning. And so that was trying to do that was the main project. Grice was a funny guy. I mean, we were very good friends and consumed a lot of liquor and senior service cigarettes between the two of us. Had a great time. But he worked in unusual ways. He originally wrote his article Meaning in 1948 for a seminar that he was giving with Peter Strawson. And everybody said, this is a terrific article, you got to publish it. And he sat on it and sat on it and sat on it. So finally, like around 1956, 57, Strawson took his copy of the article, sent it to the Philosophical Review under Grice's name, and had it accepted, and that's how it got published. So Grice himself actually never published very much. So that's how Meaning. So my first book, Meaning, was a somewhat revised version of my dissertation.
And in then from that you went to Remnants of Meaning, and in that it also
Right.
has been said that you argued against.
I became an apostate.
Yeah. You argued against the compositional view that Frege had said, right? Would you outline for me, please, Frege's compositional view, and then we can see how you broke it down, because I found that very interesting.
Right. Yeah. Well, almost everybody at the time, especially. Well, I wrote. When did I write it? I began. It didn't take me long to start giving up the Gricean line, which I called intention-based semantics. It was a very heavily reductionist line. The way I conceived it was, you take mental content, the content of Belizeans, as primary. They're the starting points. You give an explication of what it is for them to have content. And then you explain the meanings of words and sentences in terms of their relations to these mental states. And I had a lot of help at the time. It was very stimulating. I was teaching at USC, University of Southern California, my colleagues were Hartree Field and Brian, and especially talking with Hartree and Brian was very stimulating. We would meet all the time, and that really helped me to focus my ideas. And I guess at least by 1980, I started to think that it was all wrong. I thought that the reductionist program was wrong. You couldn't really give reductive accounts of anything. You couldn't first give a reductive account of mental content. And you couldn't carry out any kind of Gricean or any other kind of program to explain speaker meaning in terms of the content of, to explain, the idea was to explain expression meaning in terms of speaker meaning, and speaker meaning in terms of the contents of mental states. And I thought no step in that procedure could be done. Now, where compositional semantics came in was this. One thing that any kind of theory of meaning must be able to explain is the fact that humans have the ability to understand indefinitely many sentences that they've never heard before. Okay, if I say to you now, there's a zebra in my pocket. I mean, you probably never heard that sentence, but you immediately understand it. Well, how do you understand it? Well, the intuitive idea that everyone's always had is that you understand it because although you've never heard the sentence before, you've heard the words, you're familiar with them, you know what they mean, and you know the semantic import of its syntactic structure. And you put it all together and Bob's your uncle. This way of thinking of it, I guess, was first emphasized by Frege. In the late 60s, Donald Davis had made a very big deal about it. And he visited Oxford, actually right after I left. I left in '67 to go to Berkeley. Grace and I went to teach at Berkeley, and Davidson went to Oxford to give some lectures, and he had a tremendous influence on the bright young people there, like Gareth Evans and John McDowell and so on. And his whole thing was all about compositionality. But he thought that a meaning theory had to take the form of a Tarski-like truth theory, which was compositionality. Now, I argued that a compositional semantics wasn't possible, and I tried to show how one could nevertheless explain how we're able to understand, novel utterances, how that isn't precluded. So we might, as regards spoken language, that was easy. We could think of the speaker as realizing something like a translation mechanism that didn't give the meaning of anything, but rather mapped the speaker's utterances onto the hearers, onto expressions in the hearer's mentalese. And the problem then was to give an account of meaning in mentalese that didn't involve compositionality. That was harder to do. Actually, I'm still working on it because my language has gotten even more radical because I've been doing a lot of work on vagueness, which is very hairy. Maybe we can come back to that. So the idea was to try to explain this ability that everyone wants to explain in terms of, this won't be very informative, but in terms of certain ways of language processing that involve kinds of compositionality, but not the kind of compositionality that people like Frege and Davidson are talking about. Jerry Fodor wrote a very nice review, critical notice of my book, Remnants of Meaning, in which he said, yes, that's right. He supported it. I don't think anyone else did. It was nice to have his support. Anyway, there was a fair amount of discussion of it, mostly critical. I wasn't really impressed with anything I read. I mean, I didn't see anything as refuting what I was saying. But anyway, that's life. That's how it always goes.
For sure. I was put onto it by a student of Edward Whitton, and funnily enough, the nephew of Edward Said, he put me onto it. He said it was an absolutely brilliant book, and when I picked it up, I thought it was absolutely genius. I really enjoyed it.
Oh, who was the nephew? I knew a guy in New York.
Was he called George Schiffer?
Was he Palestinian?
Mm-hmm.
I may have known him. I think I may have gone to his wedding at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City.
Yes, that's him.
Yes, sure, I knew him. Yeah, okay. He didn't really study much with me. I'm not sure he took any of my seminars, but I knew him. He was a very, very outgoing guy. And he invited me to his wedding, and I went. I often wondered what happened to the marriage and what happened to him.
And he's still practicing. And maybe about 3 or 4 years ago, I asked him for some help when I was doing my dissertation. And like I said, he put me onto you, and he had nothing but good things to say about you. When I read you, I thought, nah, you're absolutely brilliant. And he didn't have it. I'm not sure whether he'd read The Things We Mean or not. And the Things We Mean is the last book of yours that I picked up. And the first thing that interested me about that, it's very interesting, is the concept of pleonastic propositions. So could you outline that for the people that might not know what that is, please?
Right. Well, please say hello to George for me. And
I will, absolutely.
I'm glad to hear that he's still in philosophy. I lost touch with him. Uh, he must have moved. I don't know what happened. I guess he dropped out of CUNY and left New York. I tried to get in touch with him, but without success. Anyway, yeah, the idea of a pleonastic proposition starts with the idea of a pleonastic entity. Okay, and pleonastic, the notion of a pleonastic entity is a notion of a kind of cheap ontology, of getting things on the cheap. An example would be when James Joyce wrote Ulysses, the opening sentence says, you know, stout and portly, what was it? Buck Mulligan, you know, walked down the stairs with a razored mirror and blah, blah, blah. Now, Joyce wasn't trying to refer to someone named and failing miserably. Okay. He knew there was no such person. He was making as if to refer to someone, and the reader was supposed to collude in this pretense, and that's how fiction works. Okay. When we enjoy, you know, a work of fiction, we make believe we're reading about or watching something that's actually happened. Of course, we know that the characters don't exist or anything. Okay, so by writing this piece of fiction, Joyce wasn't actually referring to any human being named Buck Mulligan, okay, although he was making as if he was doing that. And I don't think anyone would dispute that. But there, in doing that, he created a real entity, an abstract entity, to which we can and do refer. For example, we can say the fictional character, Buck Mulligan, isn't as famous as the fictional character Molly Bloom. Okay, or the fictional James Bond was a detective. The fictional spy James Bond was much more famous than the fictional detective. What's his name? Dalgleish. You know, Dorothy Sayers' detective. Anyway, now here we're really referring to something. But what we're referring to is not any kind of a person, but to a certain abstract entity. Now, I'm not the only one who holds this about that. Okay. Kripke gave a series of lectures on this and other people. But what I was trying to do was to explain how this pretend use of a name, the use that the writer is engaging in when he writes the fiction, can give rise to an actual being, to an actual abstract entity. Okay. And I called that, and when we use the name in that way, I called that the hypostatizing use. Well, how's that possible? How's it possible to bring an abstract entity into existence merely by pretending to refer to some real person? You can put an edge on this question in the following way. The existence of the fictional person simply completely supervenes on this pretend use of the name. You write a story, pretend, and use the name in a pretend way, then you thereby have created a fictional character with that name, okay, whether or not you know it. So let's suppose that there's a world exactly like the actual world, with the following difference. All the works of fiction that exist in our world exist in that world. And consequently, all the fictional characters that exist in our world also exist in this other world, simply because they just supervene on this pretend use of names. However, the inhabitants of this other possible world don't have the concept of a fictional entity. So they don't know anything. We know about the fictional spy James Bond and so on. They don't know anything about that. They don't know, they don't know that there are fictional characters. They can't say the fictional, they can't say things like the fictional character Buck Mulligan was based on someone James Joyce knew. So the question arises, okay, we have knowledge of these things, they don't. How can we bring them up to epistemological snuff with us? How can we bring it about that they have the knowledge that we have? And the suggestion I made was, well, that's easy. We simply get them to adopt a certain language game. The language game we play in the hypothesizing use. How does it work? Because if you have that use, then you have the concept of a fictional entity, okay? And it's a conceptual truth that if someone uses a name in a pretend way, then eo ipso, there exists this abstract entity that is the fictional character. Now, a lot more had to be said to make this precise and concrete. And that part may have been a little dense. I invoked the notion of what's called a conservative extension. And why couldn't we can do this with fictional entities? Why can't we do it with the other thing? I introduced the notion of a wish state. A wish state is defined as this: it's a person who comes into existence when somebody else wishes for a date. Okay, you wish for a date, whammo bammo. There she is. Okay, why can't they be pleonastic entities? Okay, haven't I read my Kant? And the difference is that there's a conceptual connection in the one case, but not in the other. And that what explains that is this business about conservative extension. A theory T conservatively extends a theory T prime, okay? If adding T to T prime doesn't permit you to assert anything, any sentence of T prime that you couldn't already assert, okay? But if you add the notion of a wish state to any theory, it won't be a conservative extension. Because if there are 20 people in the room, now there'll be 20, you can say there are 21. So it does, that's something you can say in the original theory. So it doesn't conservatively extend it. But pleonastic entities, when they're introduced, do give conservative extensions of pre-existing theories. And that's what makes them okay, kosher. I mean, it gets a little more complicated that people have objections and they reply to them, blah, blah, blah. So another example would be of a pleonastic entity would be that of a property. And the hallmark of a pleonastic entity is given by what we might call a something from nothing transformation. This is a valid inference in which no reference is made in the premise to a certain thing, but the conclusion contains a singular term that does refer to that thing. So in a way, these inferences entail, they don't bring these things into existence necessarily as they do in the fiction case, but they secure their existence in a logical sense. An example would be this: Fido is a dog, therefore Fido has the property of being a dog. That's a something from nothing inference. It's conceptual. It's not formally valid, but it's conceptually valid. It's impossible for the premise to be true, the conclusion false. Okay. Now, the premise the only singular term in the premise is the name Fido that refers to the dog. There's no singular term that refers to the property being a dog. But in the conclusion, you've got this new singular term, the property being a dog, that does refer to the property being a dog. And so in this way, this is what makes properties pleonastic entities. They're secured, their existence is secured by these something from nothing conceptually valid inferences. Another example, events have this status too. So if I say Mary was born on a Tuesday, therefore her birth was on a Tuesday, it's a valid inference. There's no reference to a birth. Births are events. There's no reference in the premise, but there is in the conclusion. Okay. And of course, with propositions, you have this. From John believes that snow is white, we can infer, John believes the proposition that snow is white. Or John believes, or snow is white is true if and only if snow is white. Therefore, it's true that snow is white. That clause there refers to the proposition, if and only if snow is white. So these are pleonastic entities too. And that gives you propositions in a very cheap way. And but now you had to say something about the nature. Typically, the nature of these pleonastic entities is determined by these something from nothing inferences. They only have the properties that you can read off them. Well, that's not quite true of propositions, because you can ascribe belief in them to people. But there's a huge difference, and this was crucial to the theory of using them as the objects of belief and other attitudes. In the book, I use the example of Picasso admired Matisse, and Picasso admired Brecht. Well, to truth evaluate those two sentences, you first have to determine the reference of the names Matisse and Brecht, okay? And then determine whether Picasso stands in the admiration relation to those references. That's not how propositions get referred to in belief sentences. Okay. No one doubts that every eye doctor is an eye doctor. No one doubts that every ophthalmologist is an eye doctor. Now, these two sentences have different truth values. Okay. Now, go back to the Matisse and Brecht example. The difference is this. We don't have to first determine the reference of the that clause in order to truth evaluate the sentence. We first truth evaluate the sentences, okay, in a way that tells us that they have different truth values. And that is what enables us to say that the two that clauses refer to different propositions. So the process of the kind of relation that singular terms bear to their reference is very different in case of propositions. And that's what figured essentially in the account of belief sentences and so on that is in the book.
Would that mean then that abstract mathematical objects are considered by your account pleonastic entities?
That's an excellent question, which I mostly tried to avoid. I'm inclined to think I'm inclined to think they have to be.
What is the main problem, would you say then, with considering mathematical objects pleonastic entities?
I don't know that it is a problem. I think that, I think that a lot of people hold this. They think that, they're, as it were, products of the way we use mathematical language, in the way that, fictional characters are and propositions are. But the story gets complicated because the way we use mathematical language has to obey certain kinds of rules. And that's apt to make it look as though, the rules are derived from the nature of these numbers or mathematical entities and so on. I don't think that's what's going on. I think that the rules are constrained by logical rules, and that we get the mathematical entities in the pleonastic way. This is a view that other people hold, and Hartree Field sometimes describes himself as an eliminativist about numbers, but he's had, well, if by numbers you mean pleonastic numbers, then I'm okay with that. So I would say the same thing, but you can expect more resistance there. People care more about mathematical entities than they do about fictional characters or propositions, although properties they care about too. But yeah, I would. The main obstacle, the main problem I would see people raising as regards numbers. Let me change the subject slightly.
Yeah.
Hartree Field is a famous nominalist. He believes that numbers don't exist. He said, well, how could they? If they exist, how could we speak reliably about them, knowledge of them? It would be like someone claiming to have some guy in, Leeds, some plumber in Leeds, claiming to have very detailed knowledge of the goings on in some remote village in the Himalayas. And he knows everybody's name, but he has no contact with that village. He's read nothing about it. It seems impossible. There's no causal connection. Well, similarly, if in using mathematical language, we're referring to mathematical objects, how do we explain that? What's the relation between the numeral 4 and the number 4 that makes it the case that the numeral refers to the number? These numbers are often Plato's heaven. They have no physical properties. What kind of access do we have? Well, here is where pleonastic entities help. It's a conceptual truth, okay? That if there are 4 people in the room, so this is something from Nothing Happens, then the number of people in the room is 4, okay? And that's a conceptual truth and you get the concepts that enable you to know those things by learning how to use mathematical language. And he, Field himself, sort of accepts that story. I mean, he thinks it's the only story that could explain how we do know and refer to these things. The person who first made a big deal about this was Paul Ben-Asraf at Princeton. And he has two famous articles, and I always confuse their titles. When he wrote his article, the dominant theory of knowledge at the time, I guess in the 60s, was the causal theory. To know something, to know the P, you had to be causally related to the fact that P. Well, how the hell can you know that 2 + 2 equals 4? You can't be causally related to that. And Field sort of embellished that argument so that it wasn't just how could you have knowledge of these things, but how could you have any reliable beliefs about them at all? And doing that was good because it divorced it from causal theory of knowledge and so on. And so people nowadays talk about the Ben-Asraf Field line on nominalism. But Field himself is happy to go along with these things if they're construed in a pleonastic sense. He likes the slogan that, as regards David Armstrong was not a nominalist. He was trying to be snarky, and he characterized a nominalist position of a certain kind as the position that, according to which propositions are mere shadows of sentences. Well, in a way, that metaphor is made real by the pleonastic theory. And Field likes that idea. Well, if they're mere shadows of sentences, I can live with that. Okay. So that's the line I would take on mathematical knowledge too.
What do you think about, I know this has been probably research topic for a while now, but what do you think about, it's particularly, it seems to me to be the limit of this, philosophers that are trying to naturalize theories of content and trying to ground it down into science?
Yeah, for a long time, that was the name of the game, all through the 70s. How are we going to, show that numbers, propositions, are part of the natural order? Meaning, intentionality. There's some nice quotes by Jerry Fodor on this. He said basically just physical facts. And it was thought at the time that to answer this problem, to give it a naturalistically respectable account of these entities, one had to be able to identify them with, naturalistically kosher things. Okay. As regards mental states and propositions and so on, especially mental like beliefs and desires, the dominant theory was functionalism. Okay. That the idea that what makes a mental state a belief that P is the way it's related causally and counterfactually to other brain states in one's head. Okay, you think of the brain as being a certain kind of computer, and because they have these functional roles, we can identify them with these mental things. Well, that didn't work out. Brian Lohr did for functionalism what Leibniz did for God. I mean, Leibniz was a very smart guy. He wanted to prove God's existence. And a consequence of the argument he gave was that this is the best of all possible worlds because God's supremely good, he's omniscient, he's omnipotent, how could he mess up? Voltaire, as you know, in Candide had a field day on that. This is obviously not the best of all possible worlds. If it were, it wouldn't contain Donald Trump.
Very true.
Or COVID-19.
Very true.
Okay, so Lohr made the best attempt that I know of to show how you can reduce propositional attitudes to functional relations. And that's good because even functional relations are defined in terms of causal relations, but they're realized by physical things. So they're all right. So the notion of a doorstop is a functional notion. That, something can be a doorstop made of anything. It just has to be able to perform the task of keep holding the door open. Okay. But most doorstops are realized by material objects of a certain kind. So that's enough so if you can reduce the notion to a functional notion, this way that's realized by physical stuff, you're home free. And that's what Brian Lohr tried to do in his book, Mind and Meaning. And in the second chapter, I think it was, of Remnants of Meaning, I had a very lengthy and detailed discussion of his theory and tried to show that it was wrong. He actually accepted the objections and gave it up. And once you don't have that, it's hard to see how you're going to have any kind of a reduction. You might still believe in some kind of supervenience or groundedness, which is some kind of necessitation that doesn't require that you actually identify these things with those things. But I think people gave up when they realized that functionalism wasn't going to work. I think they gave up on trying to show that mental entities, things like that, were naturalistically kosher by identifying them with functional entities and relations realized by physical things. And huge literature on this in the 70s, I guess, and early 80s. Almost no literature on it now. People don't worry about it. They talk. Popular now is a notion, I think, maybe invented by Kit Fine, called groundedness. That is essentially the same as far as I can see, it's a notion of supervenience. But that's supervenience without reduction is a kind of a mystery. For example, G.E. Moore held that that moral properties were not naturalistic properties, but yet moral facts supervene on naturalistic facts. You couldn't have two possible worlds that were factually identical in terms of naturalistically identical, but differed in their moral properties. How on earth do you explain that? So just simply invoking things like supervenience doesn't really get you off the hook. And it certainly, no one thought it got G.E. Moore off the hook. They thought that he was just adding mystery to mystery. But insofar as people talk about these things now, they talk about them in terms of facts of kind A being grounded in facts of kind B, and so on. I mean, this kind of issue arises off in philosophy of science all the time. You have to explain the relation of higher order or special science theories like biology to basic physics. Okay. No one thinks you can actually give it a reduction, but there's some very tight relation that would explain how the one sort of emerges from the other, or they're supposed to be. You know.
Excellent, excellent. So let me finish then with a final question. Is there anything you're working on now that you'd like to discuss, Professor Schiffer?
Yeah. I'm trying to write a book on vagueness. I've written a lot on vagueness. Philosophical interest in the concept, by vagueness, I mean the vagueness that goes with borderline cases. So, is Jones bald? Well, he's got some hair, but you wouldn't say he's not bald. I mean, he's not like Tom Cruise, but nor is he like Yul Brynner. You probably don't even know who Yul Brynner was. He was an actor, I guess, whose head was as hairless as a billiard ball. Your borderline cases. In vagueness, the notion of vagueness is defined in terms of borderline cases. So a predicate is vague if it's possible for there to be borderline cases of its application. Okay, so being bald, being thin, being wealthy, borderline cases. And so that's the notion. You know, being red, is it red or orange? Well, it's sort of in between, it's borderline red orange. The philosophical interest in vagueness stems from a paradox that's a few thousand years old, the so-called sororities paradox. Sororities is the Greek word for heap. And the paradox was originally stated in terms of how many grains make a heap. But you can construct the sororities paradox using any vague predicate. So here's one. First premise, a person worth $50 billion is wealthy. Seems right, okay? I guess some people are worth that much. Jeff Bezos. Premise two, for any number n, if a person worth n dollars is wealthy, then so is a person worth n dollars minus 1 cent. Okay, so if you're out to tea with your wealthy aunt, and while she goes to the powder room, you open her purse and take 1 penny out, you're not going to remove her from the ranks of the wealthy by doing that, okay? They can't make a difference. Here's the kicker. It now follows, by the rules of classical logic, that a person worth only 3 cents is wealthy. You can see how by repeated applications. So now, obviously, that's a paradox, because it looks like you have a valid argument with true premises and a false conclusion, but no such argument can be valid. So what's the solution? So that's what has generated most of the work on vagueness. And people have tried to give theories of what vagueness is that will resolve the sororities paradox. And a lot of that work is very technical. And you know, I've done work there too. There's a lot of stuff on vagueness in the book, The Things We Mean. And I try to use the notion of pleonastic proposition to help out with that. But now I'm interested in something else. When philosophers of language theorize about meaning, okay, they always ignore vagueness. They make no attempt to account for the vagueness of vague expressions. They write as if it didn't exist. Now, this might not be a bad thing. Maybe it's a useful idealization. Maybe it's like Galileo ignoring friction in his theories of motion. Nevertheless, the question arises, how can we account for the meaning of vague expressions in a way that recognizes their vagueness? And it's my view that that it can't be done. It just defeats every program. I got a couple articles on this. They're mostly published in obscure places. One thing that happens is, you get invited to give a talk in some really nice place, like Lisbon, where it's warm, beaches. Who doesn't want to go to Lisbon? But they say, but you got to give us your talk to publish. And they give you some crappy book with your paper in it, so no one gets to read it. But I'm trying to turn all that stuff into a book that will work all this out and show the very serious consequences. And this is something no one's tried to do. The very serious consequences for meaning that vagueness poses. How difficult it is to give an account of meaning that takes account of the vagueness of vague expressions, because the accounts that exist idealize vagueness away. You can see the so-called formal semantics is the dominant way of doing theory of meaning these days. And they're explicit about this. You look at the examples they use, that, Homer's a drunk. Well, drunk is very vague. They like to use cute examples, and what they try to do is to give certain kinds of truth conditions for these sentences. And the truth conditions they give are kinds that would be appropriate if these were precise notions, and they just ignore the vagueness and pretend they're precise notions. So they'll treat drunkenness, the property of being drunk, as a function that maps people, that maps a person. If you have the sentence, Homer is drunk, it would be a function that maps the sentence onto the value t, just in case Homer is drunk. Okay, so you're committed there to being a set that contains all and only the drunk people. Well, clearly there can't be any such set if they're if the concept of being drunk is vague. So that's what I'm trying to do. Trying to say what you would have to say if you want to take the vagueness into account. Now, when you idealize in science, that's usually not a very hard thing to do. Galileo couldn't do it. Okay, now look at my idealized theory. You want to bring vagueness in? Now, here's what would happen. Not vagueness, friction. But nobody can do that for vagueness.
Would that be somewhat connected to Wittgenstein's theory of family resemblance?
Yeah, family resemblance, and this notion of open-endedness is a kind of vagueness. I mean, concepts are open-ended when there are cases that there's no definite way of applying them. there's some remote tribe in the Amazon. They have the concept of a bird. They've never seen an airplane. Then one day an airplane flies over. Well, can they apply the word bird to it or not? Well, there's probably no determinate answer to that. It's a borderline case. So that's the case of vagueness. So, yeah.
Perfect. Well, I'll compile those articles that you mentioned a second ago that you've been sort of working on vagueness, and I'll find them and I'll put them on the link below this. So if anyone's listening and they want to catch up on your work before they buy your next book, make sure you check it out. Make sure you read it. Also, make sure you pick up Remnants of Meaning and the Things We Mean. And I really appreciate the time, Professor Schiffer. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, it's great. I enjoyed meeting you and talking to you. Are you in a car? Are you in an automobile?
I'm in a car. I literally, I'm on a break from work.
That's cool. It's very cool.